Does believing in such things called dispensations make one a dispensationalist? And what is Paul doing in Acts 21 when he goes to Jerusalem and at the request of James goes to the temple, offers a sacrifice for a Jewish vow, and to show that he's not contrary to the law of Moses? Is he being inconsistent? Is he being dishonest? Well, let's talk about these two things. This is David Preston that you see on the screen. He is a mid-Acts dispensationalist. And I've dealt with this issue quite a bit. Got several videos on it. And so he did a debate recently, and I want to just touch on a couple of points that he made, and perhaps more in the future. And I don't find a lot of them debating this very issue, but he did it. I give him props for that. But I'm going to talk about a couple things here. Now, he's talking in this video that you're about to see to his debate opponent named Kelly, just for context, and he's, you'll see what he says, and we'll touch on them.
As far as dispensationalism goes, you're a dispensationalist too. I watched your video about mid-acts, or there was one video that you admitted that you believe in dispensations. And then you admitted also that you believe that there's a distinction between Israel and the church. Those are fundamental things to dispensationalism. So no matter what you say in the most basic dictionary sense, you are a dispensationalist. And I hope you are, because, if you're not, then you're definitely going to stumble. I mean, look at...
All right, so to that first point there. Now, I don't know a lot about his debate opponent. In fact, I'm currently asking him about if this was a fair representation. So I'm not saying he did any misrepresenting here. I just don't know about that. It depends. But what I do see is false representation by dispensationalists, especially mid-Acts, who say this kind of thing when they're actually misrepresenting, which he may not be doing. But I'm taking the opportunity now, because sometimes they think, well, the word dispensation is in the Bible, or there are dispensations in the dictionary definition in the Bible. But dispensationalism, of course, is a whole theological viewpoint that is more than that. So I have a video where I'm talking about another dispensationalist, and he was saying, well, some people say to me, well, I don't believe in dispensations. And he said, well, you should, because it's in the Bible. The Word is in the Bible. Well, first of all, now that is a misrepresentation. Or it's a misunderstanding of the real issue, at the least. The word dispensation simply means the act of dispensing, or an act of administering, or using a system to administer certain things, like a law, to a people. It's not an era of time, by the way. And so according to that definition, yes, there are dispensations that exist in the Bible. God interacted with, and he administered commands, or you could say a law, to Adam and Eve that he didn't to others, like the tree in the garden. Well, nobody else was in the garden. The commands about eating from the forbidden tree or eating from the tree of life isn't something he doesn't administer through those commands to other people. Well, obviously, to the Israelites during the Mosaic regime, he was dispensing the Mosaic law to them. Excuse me. And he doesn't do that to those before the law of Moses or after. So obviously, there are different dispensations. But that doesn't make somebody a dispensationalist. Dispensationalism, as a theological construct, as a theological system, is to believe that God, number one, or I say one of the fundamental issues of it, is to believe that Israel is a distinct people of God. A distinct people of God. That God has His church, but that He also still is going to view, at least in the future, if not still yet, depends on who you ask, Israel as a separate nation that still belongs to Him, and it's still His people. And that, for example, when God raptures the church, the body of Christ from the earth, He will then focus back on Israel, and they will still have the law of Moses, still offer sacrifices. There will be a third temple. Now, this is what makes someone a dispensationalist in the theological meaning, which is the real issue. Now, he mentions two things there. So, for example, I believe in such things called dispensations in the Bible, but I'm not a dispensationalist because I do not believe that Israel as a nation is still a distinct people of God. Now, yes, they're a distinct people because they're not the church. Just because you're an Israelite or you're a Jew doesn't make you God's people in the church of Jesus Christ. But they're not a distinct people of God. God has one people because I'm not a dispensationalist. So that's my view. So when he says those two things, let's all make sure that it depends on what people mean by them. Now, he said, well, you believe that Israel is a distinct people from the church. Well, I do technically, but I do not believe they're a distinct people of God from the church. Yeah, the nation of Israel as an ethnic people is distinct from the church, because the church is God's people, God's saved people that belong to Him and serve Him and His kingdom, that serve Christ and are Christians. Well, obviously, just like Islam or just like the Chinese or just like the Hindus, these are different peoples that are distinct from the church, but they're not distinct peoples of God through the church or from the church. So, if his opponent does believe that, yes, Israel remains, especially in the future, a distinct people of God from the church, well, then his representation is fair. But I just want to be clear, you always have to be sure of that when you hear them making these kinds of statements. Okay, now let's move on.
Because, if you're not, then you're definitely going to stumble. I mean, look at Paul, for example. Paul disobeyed the Holy Ghost. He was dishonest in Acts chapter 20 and 21, as far as him going to the temple and telling James. Remember when James said, hey, there's people saying that you don't keep the law of Moses and you're teaching.
Now I want to be clear so that you don't misunderstand what he's saying. Obviously, as a mid-Acts guy, he believes Paul was a Christian, Paul was saved, and the apostle we should listen to. So he's not trying to represent Paul as some evil guy, other than he's talking about the human aspect of even Paul. Paul made these kinds of mistakes, and I think he's way off here. Now, I do believe Paul was human and was not sinless, but he's trying to point out human aspects of Paul, that Paul did err, and in touching Acts 21, this is the issue that I want to talk about here. And I think he's way off.
Remember when James said, hey, and telling James dishonest and
let me go back.
Paul disobeyed the Holy Ghost. He was dishonest in Acts chapter 20 and 21, as far as him going to the temple and telling James. Remember when James said, hey, there's people saying that you don't keep the law of Moses and you're teaching them that they don't need to keep the law and that they don't need to be circumcised. Acts never records Paul's actual verbal response. But instead, what happens is James says, hey, to prove them wrong, you need to go commit the vow, which includes sacrifices. This is, I think, 8 or so years after the Acts 15 council. So James the apostle, James the brother of Jesus, specifically tells Paul, hey, you need to go and do this vow, because they think that you're saying that you don't need to keep the law of Moses and be circumcised. What? I thought we just all this, what you just told us, Kelly, is stating that Peter and Paul taught the same thing. Are you, Kelly, trying to tell me that Paul maintained that we need to keep the law of Moses and we need to...
Okay, so his opponent, which I agree with in this aspect, but does believe that Peter and Paul preached the same gospel, and that's... I've proven that many times in my videos. And what he's saying is, now, wait a minute. Paul went to Jerusalem in Acts 21 and inconsistently and dishonestly attempted to demonstrate at the request of James that, no, he's not contrary to the law of Moses. And he's saying, well, if you believe they preach the same thing, then this is the result. Now, listen to that again.
That we need to keep the law of Moses.
He's saying, well, if that's the case, then it's obvious that Peter preached that you do need to keep the law of Moses. And so if they preach the same thing according to his opponent and me, then Paul preached we have to keep the law of Moses and all that.
And we need to keep practicing circumcision within our male youth? Certainly not. But James held to that belief.
James held to that view. In other words, James did teach that you have to do, you need to keep circumcising your youth and the law of Moses.
James clearly taught that you are to keep the law of Moses and you are to continue in the traditions of circumcision.
James clearly taught. Now that's quite interesting that it's so clear, yet contradicted by clear passages, which I'll get to in a moment. Clearly taught that you are to keep the law of Moses and keep these traditions. So notice he says you are to do this. So James' view, in his view, is that you do and you must continue to do these things. This is a complete misunderstanding. I mean, it amazes me. But that is the way a theological construct in your mind can cause you to see things that aren't there. Listen, I've been there. But we might play this again. Now, first of all, nothing in Acts 21 suggests that Peter preached you have to keep the law of Moses. So when he cites Acts 21, where James is telling Paul that he must do these things to show that he is not contrary to the law of Moses, and that James held to this belief, he then makes the argument that, well, you, his debate opponent, believe that Paul and Peter preached the same thing. Well, so you're telling me that Paul preached you must keep the law of Moses and all that? Well, the text doesn't suggest that that's what Peter believed, and it doesn't suggest that's what James believes either, which I'll get to. It doesn't even mention anything about what Peter believes there. Now, mid-Acts dispensationalists really give James a hard time unfairly. I hear a lot of complaints about James being a Judaizing teacher. I hear many negative statements about James. It's very clear. And since I'm attempting to make a short video, go see my other videos on these subjects and look for yourself. Acts 10, Acts 11, especially Acts 11 and Acts 15, James and the apostles and Peter himself all agree with Paul. All in that passage, in those passages, understand that being saved does not require becoming a Jew or being circumcised. And there's no hint in any of those passages that they did believe it for Israel, not a single one. But in those passages specifically, Acts 11, where Peter comes and recites what happened at the household of Cornelius, and at the end of his speech there in Acts 11, the elders and the apostles with Peter all rejoice because the Gentiles now can be saved without becoming Jews. And in Acts 15, at the end of the council, James agrees with Peter that there is no distinction. It explicitly says that in Acts 15. There is no distinction. Peter says God has made no distinction between us, the Jews, and them, the Gentiles. And that we are saved in the same way that they are. So these passages show that they all realize, contrary to mid-Acts theology and dispensational theology, mid-Acts, they all realize that you do not have to be a Jew to be saved. So I never see fair representation of James by our mid-Acts friends, or Peter for that matter. They all clearly believe that being a Jew is not essential to salvation. But they're accused, especially James, of Judaizing the Gentiles and binding these things on them. And what he is saying is that James in chapter 21 does require it, at least of Israel. But there's no hint that he ever did. Where did James ever say that these things were required for Israel? You won't find such things. You'll never find Peter or James requiring the law of Moses to be kept by even the Jews for salvation. You'll never find that. So what is really going on in Acts 21? Well, let's look at it. So in Acts 21, you have Paul coming to Jerusalem. And I have done a video on this passage, the whole passage itself. And the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. And after he had greeted them, he began to relate one by one the things which God did among the Gentiles through his ministry. And when they heard it, they began glorifying God. And they said to him, "You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews, of those who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. Now, first of all, note that they are glorifying God. Now, this would include James, obviously. So, what do they realize about the Gentiles? Well, that they don't need to be Jews. So, James is not a Judaizing teacher. He's in full acceptance that Gentiles do not need to be saved. Now, in the clip you heard, I said do not need to be saved. Do not need to be Jews to be saved. Now, in the clip that you just heard from David Preston, he's not making a statement in that clip about whether James is a Judaizing teacher for the Gentiles, but he is saying that this is what he's requiring of Paul. And he is saying Paul is inconsistent here, and that is what they taught, that you must keep the law of Moses, James and Peter, at least to the Israelites. But there's no indication of that, and it doesn't say that. But that's what we're getting into. But notice that there is clear acceptance from the elders and James that the Gentiles are fine. No Judaizing from James. Okay, and then it says, you see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. And they have been told about you that you are teaching all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses. Notice what the accusation really is. That you are teaching all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children, nor to walk according to the customs. First of all, let's understand the accusation. Because remember that David Preston is about to, or you heard, present that what Paul is about to do is being very inconsistent, but it's far from it. It's absolutely consistent. The accusation here is that Paul was telling Jews among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, which Paul never did. Let's understand something, and this is what he doesn't understand, and what a lot of mid-acts don't understand. Paul did not go out of his way, nor find it all that important, to convince Jewish people who were involved in the customs of Israel to give it all up to be a Christian. He clearly taught that Gentiles should not go to it. Because why would they? The only reason they would is because they were being convinced it was necessary in order for them to be Christians. But for Jewish people who were already doing these things, it was just the way that they were raised. And Paul never saw a problem with doing these things that was a part of their customs and traditions. Paul's going to say this, and I'm about to show you. In other words, Paul didn't see it all that essential and significant to tell Jews, stop circumcising your children. Stop resting on the Sabbath. What difference did it make? Resting on the Sabbath wasn't going to make them any further from God. Circumcising their children didn't matter. Doesn't Paul say this very thing? In Galatians 5, Paul says circumcision, uncircumcision, that doesn't matter. See, it doesn't matter if they circumcise their children. So the Jews continuing these customs that they'd always done, Paul was not going to make that an issue about them becoming Christians. Okay, Jews become Christians, that was significant. But becoming Christians and giving up these traditions, not a big deal to Paul. It wasn't necessary to stop circumcising your children or to rest on the Sabbath or keep the Jewish holy days in order to become a Christian. You didn't have to do that. That wasn't essential to Christianity. And Paul consistently, when he was around Jews and Jewish society, kept those very things, which is what Mr. Preston doesn't understand. Let me show you something. And then we'll continue reading this. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul says this. He's talking about his liberties and certain liberties that he has. He says, "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I may win more." In other words, he's not obligated to, and I'm summarizing the context basically, but he's free from all in the sense that he has no obligations really to bind himself to the opinions and thoughts and traditions or what people would have him do or the commands of men. He's only obligated to serve Christ. He's free from all, but nevertheless, He says, I have made myself a slave to all. In other words, I'm going to be very mindful of these things that they find important and consider that my liberties are not as important as them. And he says, and to the Jews I became a Jew. Now, that's exactly what he's doing in Acts 21, which Mr. Preston, in a very flawed view, says he's being inconsistent and dishonest. To the Jews I became a Jew. Now, he's saying it right here in 1 Corinthians 9. So that I might win the Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, though not being myself under the law. What's he saying? Well, when he was with, as he is in Acts 21, when he was with Jews and their society and their culture, he was going to behave as if he was under the law of Moses, even though he really wasn't, because he was free. But why does he act that way? Because he's attempting to reach them, and he's not going to put all these huge stumbling blocks in his way by completely acting contrary to all their traditions and culture, especially like it dealt with the law of Moses and these traditions that came from God. That would be a big problem. To go around Jewish society, especially in Jerusalem, and say, no, I don't do all these things. I'm not resting on the Sabbath. I don't believe in circumcision. And then try to win them over to Christ. That's going to make huge waves. But since it wasn't necessary to get Jews to stop circumcising their children, or resting on the Sabbath, or going to the temple, or offering certain sacrifices like for vows, which isn't necessarily an animal sacrifice. Those things weren't important. People could do those things. And so Paul didn't find a problem doing them himself. So like this is the example I give. If I went to Israel today and on the Sabbath, I'm not going to be walking around working. Well, I'm not a Jew, you guys. I don't believe in this thing. Listen, don't you know that it's not necessary to be a Christian? Well, obviously, they think it is important. And if I'm trying to win them over, I'm not going to completely step on their tradition that they find important, especially one that they find important because it came from God. And since it's okay for me to rest on a Sabbath without offending God, that's Romans 14. God doesn't care about days, whether you observe it or not. Then it's okay for me to do that. That's why he had Timothy circumcised. Sometimes I confuse Timothy for Titus and get them mixed. But he had Timothy circumcised when he took him to Jerusalem, not because it was necessary, but to avoid unnecessary problems. So that's what he's saying here. So, since those things were not significant, when he was among Jews, he didn't step out of his way or go out of his way to tell them stop doing these things. What he did harp on is that Gentiles do not need to start. Because the only reason they would start is because they had been convinced that it was essential to being a Christian and following Christ. That's where Paul drew the line. You are not going to tell him and start telling and teaching that it's essential to following Christ. But to those Jews who were already doing those things, well, no big deal. You'll never find Paul going out of his way to tell Jews to stop doing those things. That's the very thing that James is saying, that's what they're saying about you. And this is what David Preston doesn't understand. But we go back in Acts 21. It says, they have been told about you that you are teaching all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses. But Paul never says such a thing. He taught nobody to forsake Moses. Now, he did tell the Gentiles that there was no need for the law of Moses, that all these things pointed to Christ, and so don't start them. And if there were Jews in their number, well, they heard these things too, but he didn't tell them, you need to stop. See, there's a difference between telling Gentiles, don't start, and Jews, you don't have to stop. And so the accusation that was making the circles in Jewish society is that he was going around Jews telling them to stop doing this. But it was important. If he was going to be in Jerusalem, he doesn't need this reputation where everybody and all the Jews there that they are trying to win over to Christ think he's going around telling everybody to stop obeying Moses. Well, Paul didn't do that. And if he was going to get anywhere, especially among the apostles in Jerusalem, in the city, they need to know that he doesn't find it significant. And he doesn't teach that Jews need to stop obeying the law of Moses. To forsake Moses and telling them, this is the accusation about Paul, not to circumcise their children. He didn't do that. He did tell Gentiles, don't do it in order to keep the law of Moses. But they were already doing it, and he wasn't worried about that. They will certainly hear, now here's the problem, they will certainly hear that you have come. Therefore do this. What's he talking about? Now, Preston presented James as, he said it at the end of the video, he said, James' view is you are to do these things. No, he did not, James said nothing that these were necessary for Jew or Gentile to become a Christian or to follow Christ or to be saved. James says nothing in the text about it is necessary to be a Christian or that God requires it. What James is saying is the Jews in this society think you're telling them to stop. And if you're going to get anywhere here, that's why he says they will hear that you have come. And if they think this, it's going to be a problem for you being here. And see, James wanted Paul and him up there in his work to be successful because they were all in agreement. So James's concern is not, this is necessary to keep the law of Moses and continue in these traditions, and so you must do it too. That's not the issue, and it never says that in the text. The issue is, you have been accused of telling people, Jews, Israel, to stop doing these things. And since James, as we already know from other passages, doesn't think that they're necessary to do, but we also know that James doesn't find it a problem any more than Paul does. See, this is something else they're agreement on. Both James and Paul agree that these things, the Jewish customs and traditions, are not necessary, but they also both believe Jews don't need to necessarily stop. We're trying to win them over to Christ and get the gospel out and the revelation of Jesus out so that they can understand these things. Now, what would happen over time as the gospel spread and grew might change things. But right now, the significant thing was not Jews need to stop circumcising their children. They need to stop resting on the Sabbath. They need to stop eating unclean, or they need to make sure they continue to eat only the clean meat, according to the law of Moses. It wasn't significant to start changing all that. And so that's the issue. But Preston's view is that James thinks it's just necessary. Well, where does it say that at? It doesn't say that in this text. No, Paul doesn't think it's necessary. Neither does James, but Paul also doesn't think it's necessary that Jews have to stop. This is an issue of, notice that James doesn't say, well, you are wrong, or James doesn't say this. He doesn't say, so everybody knows you believe in the necessity of keeping the law of Moses and that it is necessary to be a Christian, or that it is necessary to be saved. Make sure you do it and show them that you do think it's necessary. No. The issue is so that they don't think that you're telling everybody to stop. Because it's okay to do it. Therefore, do this, that we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take them and purify yourself along with them. Excuse me, I'm recovering from a cold still yet. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take them and purify yourself along with them and pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads. Then all will know that there is nothing to the things which they have been told about you, that you are telling Israelites and Jews to forsake Moses and stop all this. Right? That's the issue. And that you yourself also walk orderly, keeping law, in which he would be doing. Among Israel, he was keeping law. Now, see, notice what he says. And that you yourself also walk orderly, meaning in the order of Moses, keeping the law. Is that a problem? Is that dishonesty on Paul? Is Paul going to be consistent? Is this contrary to what Paul has said? Well, how can it be? I just read from 1 Corinthians chapter 9, where Paul said that exact thing. He said, to those who are under the law, as under the law. That's very consistent. It's amazing how harmonious James and Paul are on. Everybody wants to make them different. The mid-Acts do. Mid-Acts, the Mid-Acts crew, exactly the same words as Paul. When he was with Jews, among their traditions, he was under the law. And he makes it very clear. He says, although I myself am not under the law, but I behave as though I'm under the law, that I might win them. But notice what he says, but concerning the Gentiles who have believed, we wrote, having decided that they should keep from meat sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what is strangled, and from sexual immorality. This is what Paul does. Paul's not being dishonest. He's being very consistent with things he has said. And so is James. But it is a misrepresentation of James by Preston to present him as saying, well, his view is that you are to do this thing, as if to do it necessarily as obligated by God as a Jew or as an Israelite. And just to be clear, let's listen to the last part of what he says again.
That Paul maintained that we need to keep the law of Moses and we need to keep practicing circumcision within our male youth? Certainly not. But James held to that belief. James clearly taught,
although it's never stated,
that you are to keep the law of Moses.
That you are to keep the law of Moses. Where does he say you are to keep the law of Moses? No, the context. You as in God is still obligating you to do it. That this is with their theological viewpoint. That they thought, contrary to Paul and the Gentiles, you must do this. And that Paul is going to be inconsistent in listening now. Paul said, or James did tell Paul to do it, not because it was necessary by God, but because of the accusation that had been made against Paul, as I just shown. Nowhere, never does it ever say James's view was that people need to keep the law of Moses. Now, since James primarily worked among Israel and Jerusalem and the Jews, it wasn't a controversial thing with him that they stopped doing it, or whether Gentiles had to, until that became an issue later on. At the time of this, it was earlier on. But my point is this. James and Peter are in agreement.
And you are to continue in the traditions of circumcision.
But that's not really his point, as I just showed. And I'm going to end on this. Back in Acts 15, they were all in agreement. Now notice what Peter says. God made a choice among you Jews, that by my mouth the Gentiles would hear the word of the gospel and believe. And God, who knows the heart, testified to them, giving them the Holy Spirit, just as he also did to us. And notice, and he made no distinction between us and them, cleansing their hearts by faith. Well, in other words, that's what he does to us. So Peter recognizes he cleanses our hearts by faith, if there's no distinction, and that's how. He cleanses their hearts by faith, so us as well. Well, that's contrary to what Preston is saying about Peter and James. Now, therefore, why do you put God to the test by placing upon the neck of the disciples a yoke which neither our fathers nor we have been able to bear? But we believe. Now, listen to this. But we believe that we are saved through the grace of the Lord Jesus in the same way as they also are. That is a dismantling of dispensationalism, hyper-dispensationalism especially. That's mid-Acts. So that is a blunder, and something for you to think about.